these are times Hello, everybody. We're going to give it about 30 more seconds, and then we'll get going as participants are entering the Zoom. Thank you, everybody, for being on time and for attending our first event this year. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and good evening for those of you who are out of state or on the East Coast. It's still afternoon here in the Central and on the West Coast. Welcome to our first event for the 2021-22 academic year. My name is Enrique Aleman Jr. and I'm the Lillian Radford Endowed Professor in Education here at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas, as well as the co-director for the Center for Educational Leadership. Along with my colleague, co-director Dr. Alex Flores, and our colleagues in the Department of Education, we're very happy to be sponsoring this year's speaker series and excited to have conversations around this year's themes. This year's theme is Returning to Normal is Not Enough, Reimagining Education and Enacting Justice in Our Schools and Communities. As we plan for this year's program over the summer, our center team brainstorm ideas and discuss strategies for not only challenging our conventional ways of leading and educating in our schools and in our communities, but also we're seeking to bring in speakers who could inspire us to enact justice with our local schools and with the parents and the family members and the youth who make up our community here in San Antonio and across South Texas, as ways of humanizing our leadership. Currently in the moment that we are in related to COVID and related to the racial reckoning that's been happening across the country. We are very fortunate, we feel, to have assembled such an outstanding lineup for this year, and our lead-off speaker is certainly going to set the bar high for us. He's a good friend who I've known since I was in graduate school, and he was a new assistant professor at the University of Cincinnati. Over the years, he has pushed the field of educational leadership to consider equity leadership as a core purpose and not just an add-on. He's worked with teams, he's single-authored, he's published with emerging scholars as only a good mentor can do, and he continues his work with practitioners around the country and in Texas in particular. Dr. Mark Gooden currently serves as the Christian A. Johnson Endeavor Professor of Educational Leadership at Teachers College, Columbia University in the city of New York. Dr. Gooden has been at TC since 2017, but prior to that, he was on the faculty at the University of Texas at Austin from 2009 to 2017, where he served as the Margie Gurley Say Professor of Education. He was the program director of the Principalship program and the coordinator of the Public School Executive Leadership program while he was there. Dr. Gooden started his career, as I mentioned, at the University of Cincinnati, where he also served in various leadership roles within the College of Education, Criminal Justice, and Human Services. He has an undergraduate degree from Albany State College, which is a historically black college. He has 2 master's degrees from The Ohio State University, one in educational policy and leadership, and the other in mathematics education. His PhD was also earned at The Ohio State University in educational administration and higher educational administration, with concentrations in educational law and quantitative statistics. Dr. Gooden is an accomplished scholar and an author, having published 56 referee journal articles and book chapters. I counted them. And that's just what he's got in print. He's got several others, manuscripts that are currently in progress. In addition to 5 books that he's authored. He served as an editor and an editorial board member for some of our leading journals in the field, and has been awarded numerous academic and service awards for his contributions to the larger field of educational leadership, including the J.D. Scribner Mentoring Award given by the University Council for Educational Administration, which is our premier research and leadership organization in the country. He's spoken and consulted with universities and public schools and school districts around the country, and his current research areas are anti-racist leadership, the principalship, culturally responsive leadership, and law. Again, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Mark Gooden with us today, and we're looking forward to hearing his words of wisdom. I'm going to turn the time over to Dr. Gooden. It's great to see you, sir, and we're looking forward to hearing your words today.
Thank you, Dr. Aleman. That was a fantastic introduction. I Really appreciate that. I did not know I had 56 publications, so I got to take you on the road with me to help me do better when I present myself. Thank you so much, sir, for the great introduction. Before I get started, I did want to just say a brief word of recognition and honor for the life of Jay Scribner. One of the honors of my career was being named for that J.D. Scribner Mentoring Award. And if you don't know, he recently passed away, and such an inspiration to me as a young assistant professor, coming to my sessions and encouraging me also way back when to apply at the University of Texas at Austin, encouraged me to get in there and apply for it, and saying, this is the job for you. And then stopping by my office at times to just encourage me when he and his wife Alicia were living in Austin. So such a great life. So thank you all for having me. I know I'm very excited to be here to talk about our book, but also talk about what Professor Aleman is doing, this great national speaker series. So it is indeed an honor and some pressure to kick it off. So I'm going to do my very best to do a really good job, because I know there's some really great speakers coming behind me in the upcoming weeks. So employing the 5 practices to enact justice in our schools and communities. I do want to say, if you are on Twitter, I have at Gooden PhD. I've tried to be creative and put in my Twitter handle there. So please feel free to follow me and post about the session. And I also want to honor my co-authors, Sharon Rad, Gretchen Givens-Jennerette, and George Theo Harris, who are not with me physically today, but they're with me in spirit. And I believe Dr. Rad may be on the session with us. So these are pictures of these really wonderful and beautiful people who have encouraged me along the way to do this work. And there's just brilliant co-authors. As you can see, we represent different racial and gender identities and cultural identities, but we have encouraged each other in the process of writing this book. And we like to say, this is not a book we rushed to write. We took our time and wanted to make sure that it was doing what we needed it to do to speak to the field. So I'm really honored to be on as a co-author with them. So as we move forward, we wanted to just jump right into the 5 practices for equity-focused school leadership. So if you look over to the right and in the PowerPoint, you will see what we have started to call our flower of power. And it gives you those 5 practices. And if you start at the top, you'll see prioritizing equity leadership. I'm going to talk about that a little more in detail. And if you see in gold right in the first 2, the second one is preparing for equity, the ongoing emotional and intellectual work of equity leadership. So I wish I had a lot of time to discuss all of them, but I understand several of you already bought the book, and you can read through this in detail. And we're gonna have a Q&A session where we can talk through some of these pieces. Third, we're going to talk about developing equity leadership teams, briefly touching on that, essentials for leading toward equity together. The 4th practice is building an equity-focused system, identifying those needs and planning for systemic change. And the last but not least, sustaining equity, preparing for the long haul. So if you look at the top, we really work our way around the flower of power in a clockwise way, but in the center is equity. And so this visual, I hope you will hold in your mind and think about as we go through this, that the center of this work really is making schools more fair and equitable. So moving right along, this first practice, prioritizing equity leadership, adopting a transformative approach. If you are an aspiring leader and if you are interested in doing equity work, you want to have a transformative approach. You want to have an equity vision. Many leaders are wanting to engage in the work and wanting to know, what is it that I have to get started? Well, prioritizing equity leadership is a number one way of engaging, and having that equity vision helps you get started and understanding who you are and how that works. But I realize we have to go back and do some defining of what equity is. I will do that, but I first want to start with inequity, because many folks these days are saying, well, the system is inequitable, or we want to address equity in this way or that way. But sometimes we're not as clear, or we're not as open in sharing what those terms really mean. So I've taken the liberty to use an example I've used a couple of times before, and this is a pyramid that's actually represented in the book, to talk about what does educational inequity look like? I mean, how do we make this really visible? Because oftentimes when we're talking to people about equity, once again, we don't visualize or give people a strong visual of what that means or strong, rich definitions to hang their hat on when they start trying to do this work. So let's start with levels of systemic inequity. Educational inequity lies in systemic inequity. And so we use this term systems, and we talk about systemic inequity in the book. But historically, if you look at the bottom, I want to have you just look at the purple band where it says historical. School segregation, I want to rely on as an example of historical inequity. And we're familiar with school segregation, where we separated people by race into the schools and then talked about what would happen within the schools when we separated folks, after we separated them, and then even as we tried to desegregate schools. What that resulted in is a historical lack of access for certain Americans. Now, if you move on up to this, I guess that is like a red band, we talk about structural inequities. So structures tend to support our inequities. In other words, they're built in. So when we have school segregation, it's correlated with residential privilege and school choice and how we fund schools, which Dr. Alleman has written about in his great article, talking about how schools are funded and how we can use critical race theory to have a better understanding of how those inequities are enacted. But we don't stop there. We include laws, rules, policies, and procedures, which again become institutional in how we deny people access to education. Why do I start here? Because people oftentimes don't think about these three pieces. They do tend to think about what's individual and interpersonal around inequity. It's like these overt intentional acts. And if you want to say systemic inequity, or if you want to say systemic racism, you can go ahead and do that, because this is a system that's predicated on race. So what we tend to see is what's above this horizontal line at the right is what's visible. These are the things that are socially unacceptable. So in other words, people who use racial and inequitable terms or say things, we think about that as being language that we wouldn't use when we see it, and we say, oh no, that is not what you should be doing. However, we tend to miss what's below the horizontal line. These are the things that are invisible, and they tend to be so invisible and acknowledged so in such infrequent ways, or sometimes not at all, that they become socially acceptable and people tend not to see them. So this is what it looks like to think about an inequitable system and breaking down a particular example. Now, we need to have a response to systemic inequity. We need to have a set of beliefs undergirded by critical consciousness, ways to study and engage in this work. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. And that needs to be closely connected to positive actions that are implemented to provide, again, fair access to those who are adversely situated, often due to what historical, structural, and institutional factors. In education, equity might involve teaching. It could involve the curriculum, the climate, and or the school community. If you've been reading about critical race theory, and I suspect you have with Dr. Alleman, you will see historically how these pieces are baked into the systems, but we don't oftentimes examine them or interrogate them. Being sensitive to those outcomes, having an equity lens helps us create a space to grow for all children, especially those who have been marginalized by systemic inequity. Racially competent leaders acknowledge inequities and consciously work to dismantle the system and rebuild one that is more equitable. Equity provides us with an opportunity to interrogate the role that our systems play or have played historically in maintaining systemic inequity. So a lot of people would say, well, what is racism or institutional racism? What does that have to do right now with the way schools have been organized? And there are folks who would tell you that has nothing to do with it. You can't prove it. But they haven't gone through the analysis that I'm talking about now to really interrogate those systems. So questions you might ask yourself: are you a racially competent leader? Have you done the reading? Have you done the studying to understand how these systems work and how you can make them more visible to people so they can see them? And then we have stories. Which stories have you heard about why we fail to do better in equity work? These are some common ones. These kids don't want to learn. Their parents don't care. My colleagues, it's always somebody else for a lot of people, aren't capable, cooperative, or invested. What about me though, right? I don't need this. It's not relevant to me, right? Or I believe in equity. This is some of the newer ones we're hearing. I believe in equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. Think about that a moment, right? I believe in equality of opportunity, but not equality of outcome. And the latter piece of that is what we strive to engage in, what we strive to do work to try to achieve. It's a vision. CRT is being taught in our schools. Critical race theory is being taught in our schools, right? So that therefore it is a problem and we need to get it out. Or CRT is divisive because it acknowledges systemic racism. So it's almost as if we didn't talk about systemic racism, then it would not exist. We know that that's not true, but we have people really saying to us now in some of these debates with school boards, we must not talk about this, right? We have to really talk about ways to support students and make sure everybody's on board and everybody can learn. But then we also know that the system really does disenfranchise a number of folks. So the stories about why we can't get better point in the opposite direction. And we know that stories shape our reality and our understanding. But we need to create new stories. We need to be about creating new stories that drive justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we are fully capable of doing that within our schools. So we move on to this practice too, preparing for equity. How do we start to create these new narratives? What are the personal stories that we have and how are we really positioned in this work? So the ongoing emotional, intellectual work of equity leadership is what we want you to prepare for. So here's a great statement from the book. Our experiences, paradigms, and identities contribute to systemic inequity and inequality. Oftentimes we don't know and we are not aware of that, but they do. So we need you to commit to being open to ongoing learning for the rest of your career. And the book really does, and I'm going to talk more about pieces of it, but we really are trying to give you some exercises to really unearth what are my paradigms? What are the ways in which I think about identity? And then what are the ways in which I might be doing things unwillingly, unknowingly, unintentionally to create a system that's filled with inequity or continuing inequitable approaches. So prepare for equity. Dr. Alleman was talking about ways that you can engage with different types of identities. And we talked about race, and he was referring to a piece called Do You See What I See, that I co-authored with Ann O'Doherty, where we talk about using this concept of racial autobiography. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about race as an identity type to start the conversation. We talk about 7 other types of identity in the book, and each one in each section, we take folks through steps to really interrogate where you are or what might be happening in your mind, in your consciousness around these different types of identity. So for instance, when we do the identity work, we really are trying to move you into a place where you can understand where you are in this hierarchy of inequity. We are all a part of it. Unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to think about it, we don't step outside the hierarchy. This is not like I'm looking at it from over there and I'm seeing inequity happening. No, we are participants in it. Whether we are conscious of it or not is another conversation. So then we start with who am I? Personally, aspects of identity. I'm going to talk about myself very quickly. Black, I identify as Black, but I see it that in terms of being intersectional, intersecting with heterosexual, Christian, cisgender, able-bodied male. Culturally identify as African-American. For me, that is intertwined with spiritually, intellectually, collectively connecting to particular traditions, using things like humor to get by, appreciating soul food, understanding that growing up, I always heard you have to be twice as good as white people to survive and to do better and to achieve. But understand also that survival is a form of resistance, but also you can wear yourself out and overstress yourself in these systems. And we sometimes don't talk about things like John-Herianism or the imposter syndrome, which is the other side of trying to do so much to really convince a system that you belong, that you're supposed to be there. So I could talk long about this, but understand that there's protest music, dance, spoken word, athleticism, all things that came into my environment or my space about culture. Reading, storytelling, and speaking were things that I tended to excel at. Globally, though, I recognize myself as being a national citizen, being from, as you heard Dr. Alleman say, a southwestern part of the United States, going to Albany State University, historical Black college and university, but spending 15 years in Ohio, moving from an HBCU to the Ohio State University, predominantly white institution, noticing that there were very different values from the space of being nurtured at an HBCU to being very fiercely competitive at a predominantly white, had an impact on me. And it was indeed shocking to my system. But as a teacher, I held on to several unresolved questions about race and culture and their impact on me as a teacher and how they impacted who I was and what I was trying to do, and starting out at a predominantly African-American urban school in Columbus, Ohio. So for me, all of these experiences provided a platform for my preparation, indeed a gateway into richer experiences regarding race and my personal experiences around learning and leading. So this is something I'm going to touch on very quickly. It's not in the book. This was provided to me by Lucy Green, one of my students at Teachers College, Columbia University. And it talks about having access to power, and above the dashed line, you see access to power and privilege around identity, whereas that same identity might be defined as by dominant as other. So for instance, if you might be a race in this country that's a race that's obviously privileged, is white, then you would say, then I have access to power and privilege. But if you might be a person of color, like a Latinx person, you may say, I don't have access to all of those. So then I feel like I'm in that situation, and it limits my opportunity and threatens my safety and compromises my health and subordinates my identity in some way. So just another way to think about the many aspects of identity, how they can eventually come together beyond race and culture. But starting with race and culture is what we do in the book, so we can give people a space to build that foundation. So not to spend so much time on this, but I'll go deeper into this and how it connects to who I am professionally. For me, there are intersections in this work that I do, and I think that folks need to reflect on that when they start to do their work as leaders, and ask yourself, why am I really going into this space to lead? Because it is a challenge, and it is going to challenge your perspective and who you are as an individual. So moving on beyond that, I wanted to just say very quickly, personal, professional, and intentional ways of thinking about who you are. As I said before, who am I and how am I situated on the racial hierarchy and within the history of the United States? Professionally, who am I? Am I as an aspiring leader? I know several of you are working toward your principal licensure and certification and your master's degree, but who are you as a teacher leader, and what influence do you have right now? What do I do on purpose to make a difference? How do I use my power right now to impact schools? So this thing about intentional impact as being defined as something that you use to deliberately disrupt and break down these inequitable systems. And we talk a lot about that in the book, disrupting and creating a new equitable system. And how have you, have you considered these questions lately or ever? Now, we're not going to do this, but we did talk about reflections, and they are, I think, one of the richest parts of the book, because we give you a number of exercises to go through steps to think about your identity. Now, if we had time, I wanted to do this to say that there are a couple of things that we include in the book. One is we have a set of agreements, and we encourage all adult learners, when working with your fellow educators, to go through those agreements, especially when you start to talk about identity. You want to know where people are, but you want to give people the space to understand that this is going to be difficult work. So we want to have permission to challenge each other, but also create grounds to continue to respect each other in that work. And we go through all of those, like some that we've adapted from different aspects of our work, and then some from things that we read. So we borrowed a little bit from Courageous Conversations, for instance. So things like, speaking your truth, staying engaged in the work, making sure that you don't freeze people in time. So we have all of those in the book. So if we were doing this exercise, we would talk about isolating race and thinking about specific ways that you can reflect on just race. This doesn't mean we don't talk about other aspects of identity, but we start with one, and we know that there's some rich discussions out there about intersectionality, but we found it to be more influential and impactful when people can start with one type of identity and then build into that, much like I showed you in my own aspects of my racial autobiography in the last couple of slides. So if we were doing this, and this is an exercise you'll have, you can try for later, we would say reflect on a moment, some of your personal experiences about race, and as you have defined it. Where were you? What happened at that time? What did you think then? How did you feel at that time? And what did you do in that moment? And before today, had you considered this event since it happened? Now, we find that even though it may take some time, people have experiences around race. Some of us have more experiences, but we have experiences around race. And some of us don't tend to think about them. We suppress them and put them way back in the memory. But this exercise gives people the space and the time to reflect on your own time, and in an ideal situation, and to reflect and give yourself time to unearth them, and then think through how they will work in terms of making you a more empathetic leader in doing the work. So I also have some directions. If you were doing this on a Zoom, even, you can give people the space to break out in rooms in groups of 2, and then maybe 4 in breakout rooms. If you were doing this, I would recommend starting out with just a pair of folks talking about it, because it is intimidating to talk about race or to talk about some of these for many folks. And some people feel quite comfortable. So there's a range, but we want to make sure that you understand that people are going to be in different places. And then go through steps, iterations to add more people in the group if you want to give folks the space to share. So as I said, we're not going to go through the exercise, but I wanted you to see what a racial reflection looks like and how you could do something like this fairly easily using breakout rooms in Zoom. We've done this in several sessions. I've done this with co-authors and I've done this individually and even expanded on it, okay? So in the book, we go through disruptive leadership practices, moving you towards equity and racial conversations. So these are reflective questions that are pulled right from the book. And notice we play a lot with these powerful words of how are you reproducing or disrupting the experience for students around race in terms of their sense of community and social support. Reproducing or disrupting the culture and learning of the adults at the school, teachers, administrators, staff, to create a more inclusive staff around race. And oftentimes we're saying people can have a well-placed question to challenge a colleague in a respectful way and still preserve the relationship. We did a study with some of our students who had graduated from our prep program, had gone off to get principalships. And they wanted to do this work. And they say, hey, I've gone through a program that focuses on social justice and anti-racist leadership, but people in my building have not done that. How do I bring up these conversations and still preserve the relationship? And that is very important. So we really gave them tools to be able to do that, and then continue to say, you're not really trying to beat people over the head. You're not trying to rush in and say, I'm pointing out all the folks who are racist. You're really trying to help colleagues understand where they have biases that are hurting kids, biases that are really continuing to create these inequitable systems. And we're trying to go in the opposite direction. So that's what we're trying to do with the exercises. How are you, starting with you, again, reproducing, disrupting the structures, policies, and practices around race? How are you reproducing or disrupting the curriculum relative to race? How are you challenging, what is currently the status quo and taken for granted to be what is not only normal, but correct? And that normal word, I love the way that you all are challenging and giving pushback to what that means and how we have an opportunity to move into something different. So, all right, I'm sensitive to the time. I think I was told to talk about 20 to 25 minutes. I'm going to go through a couple more points and wrap it up because we still want to get to some of the Q&A. So the American racial hierarchy, the question is it still relevant? In avoiding the rigidity of the Black-white paradigm. We know that we have just a diverse group of people, races and cultures in America. The reason we talk a lot about the racial hierarchy, or start with that as a part of the conversation, is a lot of our policies and principles tend to be built in ways that amplify this hierarchy and then place people in between. So in other words, if you are Black, aka African, given folks who were one time owned in this country, then this is why you hear conversations around anti-Blackness. And so even as people come into this country, folks are told that, oh, you don't want to be associated with Black, you want to be something different. And so this is why we talk about historically which groups have owned property. And yes, we know that there are different groups in between. And this is a very crude diagram. I want folks to know that, so you don't take a snapshot and say, this is what he believes. No, but this crude racial hierarchy is still with us. Indeed, authors write about it. Books as diverse as Isabel Wilkerson's Caste talk about the racial hierarchy, to Metzel's Dying of Whiteness. He talks about how white folks in this country are voting against their interests based on this racial hierarchy, right? Their own interests, and in terms of their politics. So it's with us, even though technically, we think, oh, that's outdated. Nobody really uses that anymore. And no, it really does define a lot of our policies. So yes, I believe the racial hierarchy is still relevant. And as Faulkner said, the past is never dead. It's not even past. So when we start saying what's happening in schools is related to those segregative laws and policies that we said were historical, but many of us know we still have school districts that are segregated, right? We still have segregation within schools in terms of how we allocate access to particular types of courses. right? We still have correlations with, if you have access to algebra, for instance, at 8th grade, then we say, oh, great, then you can have geometry by 9th grade, and that's the only pathway. We created that. We made that up. That is our way of saying certain students won't get access to this part of the curriculum, and we justify it. It's a law and a policy. But we can change that, right? We can challenge that. Never mind the longer conversation about why we are still tracking kids in the first place, right? So the racial hierarchy is still relevant, but what role do I play as an educator in enforcing the belief system of the racial hierarchy? What fuels the racial hierarchy? I mean, what unexamined beliefs, narratives, stories continue to normalize inequity and just call it like, we're just doing really good education. And we're not. We're doing a disservice to kids by not interrogating these narratives, these beliefs, and ways of doing the work, or ways of doing work that harms them. So what part of my narrative is tied to maintaining these customs, these practices, these ways of being, teaching, learning, and leading that support the system, even if I deny in polite and passionate conversations. So I'm about inequity. I'm about really serving kids. Yet in my practice, I find that I'm really doggedly fighting for and supporting systems that I know or may not know that really oppress kids and deny them an opportunity. So what and who I see is a big hint. What and who I see within the system is a big hint. So practice 3 is developing equity leadership teams, and I'm just going to touch on these last pieces. These are essentials for leading toward equity together. We wanted to really push against that great man theory of the principal is the only person that does this work. We know that there's some heavy lifting required. We know the principalship is a big job. And just like the principalship is a big job, engaging in equity in meaningful and rich ways is also a big job. So you need an equity leadership teams. You need an equity focused team to support you on this work. And we talk about that in the book, and this diagram talk about the types of educators who can support this in the center. These are the types of folks you want on board with you, but also how we expand and strengthen relationships, going back to that word that we said earlier. And how do we use those relationships to work through transforming the use of power? How do we run meetings? Do we do it in hierarchical ways and that really limit the access to certain people? Or do we say we really are trying to be more collaborative and get more voice into the space? Do we integrate our personal experiences with systems and trend data, not just a quantitative aspect of data, but what are the types of data that human beings create through these narratives? Narratives, those are data as well. And with those personal experiences of people also play into that. And then we have to assess credibility of data. We know we are in the age and time, and we were talking about this earlier, when truth is being questioned. I mean, some things that are taken for granted that, this is a fact. And in my meeting with my 3 co-authors this morning, we were just saying, not all ideas are equal, right? There are ideas that are designed to oppress people, and we can't just say, oh, you have equal access to have this conversation. And not to go too far into this, but I'm a big fan of legal approaches, as you've heard, to thinking about a lot of these issues. And even as we think about balancing things in the law, we talk about this balance, the balance of what is for the greater good, for national security, for instance, that sometimes pushes against individual rights, right? It's not always my individual rights trump your individual. It's sometimes like your individual rights really push against the greater good. So I'll move on beyond that, but you may be able to figure out a little bit of what I'm talking about, but I can always talk more in the Q&A. So building equity-focused systems. We want this work to be really a part of our everyday practices. We want you to identify the needs, and we want you to plan for systemic change. We really want to think about changing those systems. So there's a process. You start over in the upper left-hand corner where we want to think about collecting data, identifying those needs through ways of collecting data. We give examples in the book, but we also provide you with tools, including an equity audit. We talk about ways to collect data, even assessing what's happening within the climate, analyzing those data, not individually, analyzing those data with your team members, analyzing those data with the teachers and the leaders in your building, and then moving forward together to plan for change, and then moving on to enacting change. And this is cyclical. So you can see this cycle can repeat, but we want to make sure that people understand that every day you're going to be working toward, hopefully, building equity somewhere in one of these quadrants. And so this is, Sharon Rad, I think, developed this, which is really great. Talks about all these pieces, learning about self, others, and the system, then move toward building and strengthening those relationships. and then build support and engagement, and then moving around to this term I love, act skillfully and cohesively as you continue doing the work. So last but not least, sustaining equity, preparing for the long haul. We want you to be in this to win it. We want you to understand that this doesn't go away overnight. These are systems that have been with us for a very long time, and they're going to take some consistent work to really break them down. All right, so moving on to just components of sustainability, having clear values, really valuing learning and reflection, looking toward communities and continuous improvement, and then appreciating the human nature of this work. We talk about recognizing people's humanity, understanding that there are going to be people who are going to be resistant to the work. That doesn't mean they automatically become your enemy, right? Most of us, or many of our prep programs, and we know this, teacher prep and leadership programs are really just starting to go into deeper conversations and deeper work around this. Some indeed are not. But because of that, or because people have come through those programs, they may not have been exposed to this. And so we have to have some patience. Some folks are not going to sign up for it. Some people are going to say, this is just not for me. I'm not interested. I don't want to get involved. But there are folks who are genuinely going to have questions and want to be, want to say, how do I improve my, make personal improvements to get engaged with the work. And so don't be afraid of the questions. Don't be afraid of the resistance. And we do talk through that in the book and try to give people support so that they can understand how to build stronger components of sustainability. All right, so thank you for that. Stay engaged. I'm wrapping up here. We need you. Do as much as you can, as well as you can for as long as you can. We will move forward together. And one of our favorite quotes you may know is that the arc of the universe is long, but it bends, toward justice. One of Dr. King's favorite quotes, which has become a favorite of ours as well. So with that, I will just go on and say, here's a link to the book and the 5 practices group from me and my co-authors as we do the work, and I will open it up for questions.
Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you, Dr. Gooden, for giving us kind of a good overview of the book and the highlights that I think I mentioned before we came on air. Our cohort started this summer. Our current cohort, that it's a 13-14 month program, and they jump right in, and this is one of the books that we use along with Khalifa's book, his more recent book. And I think the salience of it was that the practice oriented, the strategies really help students kind of identify with doing the work. I want to encourage everybody, or anybody that might have especially since I see students on here who've read the book, if you have any questions for Dr. Gooden or anything that he might have touched on, I encourage anybody to use the Q&A or the chat function to go ahead and drop in your question or your comment. I'll start off I know you've had at least 8 to 9 years of experience of living and working here in Texas and doing work with districts of every type and preparing leaders to work in every kind of scenario around the state. As a graduate of UT Austin, I know the reach of it, and the centrality that it plays in kind of preparing leaders to be in multiple levels of leadership. The question that I had for you, and it's a phenomenon that's been happening across different states. Texas is one of the leaders in fighting against critical race theory, so-called critical race theory in the classroom. And I know you, and you were one of the early scholars in the field of ed leadership. To start writing about it and to start challenging the old ways of thinking. So this is not anything new in academia. These are questions and these are frameworks that you and others, Gerardo Lopez, Larry Parker, obviously Dr. Latson Billings in the broader field of education. But in ed leadership, those frameworks have been used, for over 20 years. My question to you is just to get your thoughts on the current state of that fight, the politics of education that's been happening, and as a scholar who uses CRT in your own work, what are your thoughts about that recent backlash and how educators and educational leaders should challenge or disrupt that narrative?
Yeah, I think you've hit on. Thank you for the question. Some major points in even how you framed it. And one of them is this is not new, right? This is like putting a new brand on the old type of resistance. And if you read between the lines, and you indeed have to read and listen to what people are saying. What is it that the folks who are resistant to this? What is it the thing that they don't like? Because as scholars who use CRT, we know that they're not really using CRT, they're misdefining it, and it's not critical race theory. But but we have to really discern as leaders, what are they really saying? And if you look behind that, what the language that they're saying is you can't talk about race in schools, and because you can't go in and make white children feel guilty. And it really, a lot of this is really misnomers. I mean, they start saying scholars who are talking about this are attacking white kids and embarrassing. Right. And they've actually made up some things to try to give more authority to this and say, watch out for this. And so what the real thing here is, you have folks who are fighting to maintain a status quo. And that's an important part of what we have to recognize as leaders. You have to be really about the work and keeping a focus on what you're doing. If you say, in a positive sense, hey, I'm fighting to make my school more equitable, and I have collected data that says several of my kids are not getting access or being suspended at disproportionate rates, or not, some of my Latinx kids are not getting access to the curriculum. So I'm really going to, are you saying to me, don't do anything about that? I mean, I think as a principal, you frame it from that. Now, the larger political conversation about this has a lot to do with, some really far right folks kind of structuring how to fight with local politics and how the midterm elections can be won at the state. I mean, that's the larger thing that I think school board members don't get a chance to get access to, because they're being bombarded and they're really being attacked in some brutal ways by these folks, and they're being, if you read into this, you'll find that there are folks who have offered trainings on how to do this, and so how to attack your board with the CRT, and so we just have to be mindful that what's the bigger conversation. So for a lot of us, this may seem new, but no, if you go back, folks may use the broader term, it is a different aspect of the culture wars. Ultimately, if you are a principal or an aspiring leader, and you say and define how you are addressing equity, and you are addressing issues of what you've been trained to do, I think it's going to be hard for people to really discount that. I'm not saying they won't, but make it difficult for people to come up to you and say, I'm saying don't support those kids who've been marginalized. And then you can say, wow, that's a really serious statement. If you are a CRT scholar and you're studying that and you want to really dig in deep into the debates, you're welcome to go ahead and do that. But I think school leaders are busy enough doing the work and understanding how best to do that. And I've written some short pieces that talk about ways to engage in the work that support what we're doing in the book as well. And people are still going to resist. They're going to say our book is about critical race. In fact, some folks have already said that. But we're like, look, they said your book is hateful and divisive. But we say, show us where it is. Show us where our book is beyond trying to help leaders become better at what they do in a current system that we know has inequities. Show us where that is the case. And most of the time people kind of give us a general, no, it's just bad because you're talking about race, you're talking about gender identity, you're talking about all these things. And so, yeah.
It's been, you mentioned local school boards and how, the macro political divisions that have happened at the federal level have now, come down to the local school boards, and superintendents and teachers are being targeted, or, they're having to react in ways in real time, in very divisive communities. I don't know if anybody's seen the new podcast. I think some NBC reporters are doing, called Southlake, which Southlake is, one of the wealthiest suburbs of the DFW, Dallas-Fort Worth area. And so the reporters have been following Southlake and what's been happening at the school board level, and how administrators and teachers and young people and families are having to react to that kind of environment in which CRT's been weaponized as a way to go after diversity, inclusion, and equity type of initiatives. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there. There's a couple questions, and I'm going to start with Monica's first because it kind of ties to, people asking about when working with far right folks, what's your best advice to start this conversation at a campus level? Like, what are some strategies? And I know you all touch on this a little bit in the book, but what are some strategies to start working with those who are on the far right or who just aren't going to get it? Go from there.
Yeah, thank you, Monica, for the question. I definitely would say, you want to be smart and use your energy wisely. The thing about people on the extremes, what I have learned, and I love being a scholar, but I also love working out in the field. The people who scream the loudest, that whole thing about the squeaky wheel gets the oil. We have to really push against that a little bit because there are people who are in the middle who have genuine questions, and we tend to respond to those folks who we can't convert some people. We don't know that yet, but if you feel like you can convert them and have a conversation with them, then great. But if you feel like they're extreme and they're not, it does not matter. I mean, there are some people, they don't like the book, they don't like me, they don't like my co-authors, and they haven't read it, and they haven't read anything on CRT. We can't, but there are people in the middle who say, I want my kids to be prepared for the 21st century. I want my kids to be working be global citizens. And if you listen to the South Lake podcast, you hear some of those same things. People, the parents saying, we wanted this to be a diverse community, and it is, becoming more diverse. And we want to, but then there's that strong element that's so threatening and that has something, oftentimes ties to powerful influences, and they scream pretty loudly. But you have to build a coalition of folks who are with you, and you have to. This is where you really develop your chops and get the support of those folks. Because if you look at the South Lake story as another example, there's a contingent of parents who have been building with developing this with some of the local leaders, and so they had I think the better part of the argument initially. But you have to continue going back to that. Those folks are serious about the work and can be supportive, and they have access to power. And some of them are in relationships with some of these people who they can probably talk to, but some are just not going to change.
That's one of those areas where you talked about earlier how teacher leaders or even assistant principals can use their power to not give more air to that kind of element that's within you, and then you focus your energy, you focus your creating spaces with those who are willing to listen. And I always tell people, like, you're not going to agree with everything that I say, but if you're genuinely willing to listen and learn and grow and embrace that discomfort that is going to be part of the conversation, that's all we're asking for. We're not asking you to buy everything. It's those that are just going to refuse that far right element that's not going to even want to listen to the conversation. That just sucks a lot of energy out of the situation.
Yeah, it does. And I would just add one more point. Too often people who are not educators will come in and tell educators how to do their jobs, right? So like, you have spent time learning and studying and going to, get your degree, and then there are some things that we should be using to prepare students to participate in a democracy. Those are not always going to be embraced, right? I'm going to paraphrase this, but there's a great quote in the Mahanor case. If you've been following the cheerleader case, who she did the stuff on Snapchat, and so Justice Breyer, in writing for that court, one of the third point he makes is so great. He said, we have to protect this speech, even though she's saying F you to the school and all this stuff. It sounds horrible, but she creates the speech off campus and she's upset, right? He says we have to be open to student protest that comes out that way, because after all, schools are supposed to be places that are nurturing democracy, right? We're supposed to be preparing them to understand how to resist the system. So that's not always going to come out nicely. And I've seen and I've heard and worked with educators who are a little bit nervous about Tinker versus Des Moines and students have First Amendment rights. But they didn't say we're going to shut it down. They said, let's walk through this and help them understand how to learn what a democracy is. And if there is give and take in the democracy, and there is disagreement, but it doesn't mean that you get to tell us how to run the democracy just because you have a little more or a lot more privilege within the system. And indeed, it's always told you that it is your system and not anybody else's.
Absolutely. Let me go back to Joe Farnsworth, Dr. Farnsworth. He's on our faculty here and works for the center, asking a question about equity audits. What advice would you give to approaching an equity audit? as a school campus? And what tool would you recommend to conduct an equity audit?
Yeah, so great question. I would say think about equity audit in the broader sense of a needs assessment. So if you're saying that at your school, if they're saying, for instance, we have an issue where we have a really negative racial climate, and maybe an equity audit is a thing to use, and we have an extensive one. You can feel free to choose certain aspects of that audit to build your needs assessment. But you might want to build, in addition to, or instead of the equity audit initially, maybe a survey just to see how are some of the folks feeling. It could be a 20-question survey. That's a needs assessment. What are our needs? Because if you say we have a climate that makes students feel unwelcome, students of color feel unwelcome, or we find that a large percentage of our Black and Latinx students feel minoritized or feel marginalized, and so we want to address that. So then you are pointing to data. So when people come in and say, hey, why are you doing this? You can say, well, what we know about our schools is we recognize that there were some major issues happening and they were not being addressed. And so that's an example, I think, of using the concept or the approach of what is that needs assessment, going back to practice 5, collecting the data, analyzing the data, right? And then making sure that as you do that, you have your team members with you. So, that old phrase, people don't argue with their own data. Don't be the administrator, just come out with this spreadsheet and the chart, but you want to go through a process where everybody's collecting data and working with you as you think that through. So those would be my suggestions for the school. And as I said, we have some examples of audits within the book.
Nice. Richard's asking about restorative justice. Do you believe restorative justice is the responsibility of the campus or district level in instituting the framework? And is there a best practices model for instituting a restorative justice model?
Good question. In an ideal world, I would love to say I believe it is the responsibility of the district and that it would be great to implement it district-wide. But I know that if that's not happening, or sometimes that vision is not there, there are ways to implement it at the school level. In fact, one of our former students did a really beautiful job of implementing restorative practices at a school in Austin at Aikens High School some years ago. And I had a chance to participate and show up and go to the school a couple of times. There are several models. So in terms of a best practices, personally, years ago, I got the IIRP training, the International Institute of Restorative Practices. But there are several ones. And they have protocols. A number of folks are doing it. The important thing is to understand two pieces about restorative practice. Understand how it is going to be restorative for students and continue to build community as a part of it, because I don't know if all models do that. And 2, making sure that if it isn't sensitive enough to address issues around race and culture and other aspects of identity, that you're comfortable enough building that into it. When I was directing the program at Columbia, we had some folks from IIRP come in, and they did their restorative practices, and they knew I was focused on an anti-racist approach. And so we talked about making sure there were examples to address that, because there are folks who've done studies. I think she's in Texas, Hillary Lustig, I think her dissertation did this, where people were using restorative practices, and as the suspensions decreased, the discrepancies did not decrease. So in other words, they went from 300 suspensions to 100, but there still was a discrepancy in between, white and students of color in terms of how they were suspended. So if you're doing that, you're working on an aspect of the problem, but you're still not addressing the racial and cultural nuance, deeper, entrenched inequity issues that are there. And so I want you to have a model or develop one by asking those questions and figuring out how we address those types of issues up front.
There's one more question, and this is tied to, we haven't really touched on the impact that COVID has had on structures and the systems and policies. Everybody's struggling with that. I know school districts and school leaders across the country are, they've been, as one of our colleagues said, there's no playbook for any of this, and it's evolving, it's changing on a daily basis, and teachers in a lot of ways and principals in a lot of ways, they've been in the classroom throughout this whole thing and trying to do the best that they can with with the limited funds that have been brought in, and the changing policies that are being made at a state level. So the question that's in the Q&A is about this idea of learning loss. How can we counter the deficit narrative of learning loss during COVID? Learning loss frames it as an individual deficit rather than addressing systems of inequities. And then here in San Antonio, like, we're one of the most segregated, depending on who you read, the most segregated or one of the most segregated cities in the country. And, you know, if anything that COVID has done is exacerbated or brought that out into the light even more. From the digital divide to access to healthcare to who's got to go into work because they're, you know, on an hourly salary, to who's not getting access to the shot. So it's just brought it more out into the open. But I think, you know, I think people are worried about immediately this problem of the education learning loss has been to the forefront. We're not talking about the systems and the structures that you mentioned and the history, the historical racism that's been in place in cities across the country.
Yeah, yeah, very good question. One thing that survived COVID, right, that remained as consistent throughout COVID was the racial and cultural inequities, right? In other words, like Professor Aleman has said, they were amplified, but they didn't go away, right? And so we should be asking ourselves, why did, I'll say it a different way, do we have solutions in place that address that? Because some of these things are, some of these inequities are so, they're just so extreme that they tend, it's almost ridiculous to try to say, let's talk about learning loss when, you know, my students, we talked about this, and they had a couple of students who were out in California. And so they were trying to, some of you may have seen this picture, and they were trying to get access to the internet. And the school said, we gave them Chromebooks. And they said, but you didn't think about the fact that they didn't have a high-speed data connection, right? And so they were literally sitting outside of like the McDonald's trying to get access to the internet so they could do their work, right? And so those images that we don't see a lot, we don't think about those when we come up with our solutions. And so we have to really reorganize and reframe our thinking and call these inequities out. And see, some of these structural pieces, even in terms of how funds are distributed, they're still so ridiculous that we must start to address them with solutions that make sense for folks who otherwise would not have access. I know some districts here. I might have a student who's doing work in New Jersey. As folks were going to online learning, there were such dramatic differences in the regions. In the region, for example, schools in New Jersey, some kids never got access to all of the 2020-2021 academic year to anything like technology. Like the first 4 or 5 months, they had packets, right? And you know, like sending packets home, whereas all the way over into some parts of suburbs of New York, parents were bringing together 4 or 5 folks in pods. And we tend to have policies that support parents who can pay to have a tutor. Our policies are built in that way. And so we have to start to think about, I understand being critical is one aspect of it, but our solutions have to address that. Mm-hmm. And we have to be bold and say, nope, that's an inequity. How do we address the inequity? And yes, we're finding that there are students who don't have access that live in this particular neighborhood. When COVID was happening, my students do this thing where they do an exploration of the neighborhoods. It's a residential segregation, it's an exploration of the community, but it starts with an exploration of the school. And they look at data from the school, they look at different, actually I'm saying that wrong. It starts with the region, and then it drills down to the community and then to the school. And the reason we do it in that order, it's a nested case study. And I originally started doing these, I was exposed to my colleague at the University of Texas, Jennifer Holm, and I've expanded and changed it a little bit. But we do that so students can see how all their aspects of these systems that are interrelated, interconnected, and they could support each other. But we also have to be critical that a lot of it is built in so they don't support each other. And I'll say this very quickly. I was reading a New York magazine yesterday, as a matter of fact, that there's a district in Mississippi that they brought together these rural districts that and the students there are predominantly Black. It's like 3,000 students. They fought against bringing it together under one superintendent because they said there's so much distance between us, nobody could really manage this. But state legislators, predominantly white in Mississippi, said, nope, we're bringing it together. It's going to save money. Here's the thing that's interesting. Those folks, they have been asked to increase their taxes and pay more, and they had gone to them with the bond. And the interesting thing in the story, the district wasn't always predominantly Black. The white citizens had left the district, but many of them had not left the area. And they had a private school. And so the private school that was predominantly white, they still were getting access to the per pupil expenditures. Wow. How is that right? How do we not push against that and say that is an outlandish and obscene inequity for kids in private schools to get access to public funds? Mm-hmm. But we won't, those things we don't say anything about. And so it's the same thing when we happen in COVID. We push out the learning loss thing, but what else would we be expecting? Imagining those kids being in that district and their lack of access, not to mention technology and web. They didn't even have the infrastructure if they had the money to pay for FiOS or somebody. It just was not there because of the extreme poverty in the area. So on
top of the suffering that families are feeling, and unemployment and healthcare and everything else, and housing. We are up against time. I know folks have to be signing off, but I want to just thank you, Dr. Gooden. Man, this has just been great. I know you're super busy and all that's going on with up there in New York and all your work that you're doing. But I think this really has been a great hour with us, and I really appreciate you spending the time and sharing your wisdom. And we'll definitely continue the work that you all and your authors are putting out there.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you all for hanging around a couple minutes more. It's been a joy, and we're all busy, but this was a true pleasure. So I appreciate the invite.
Thank you, sir. Be well. Be safe.
You too. Take care now.
Have a great evening. We'll be back together on October 11th with our next speaker, Dr. Susan Faircloth. We'll look out for the save the date on that and the information. And everybody have a great week. Thank you.